Okay, we're going to start our program today. We'll let other people come into the room as they get here. Uh, My name is Dave Myers. I'm your host, for better or for worse, for this program. And we want to welcome you on this rainy first day of fall. I'm going to introduce John Weidenhammer, who is the chair of the Berks Alliance, for some brief remarks. John?
Hi, Dave. Thanks a lot. For some reason, I just got kicked out and came back in again. But good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining our presentation. I just want to thank Dave for setting this up, and I want to thank Maura and Allison for you'll see as we get into the presentation, the tremendous amount of work that they put into preparing this presentation and getting ready for it. Again, I welcome all of you. Thanks for participating in our community conversation for this month. The Berks Alliance, as you know, is a community development organization. We're committed to improving the health, education attainment, and the wealth of the citizens of our community. So we thank you for your support, and I'll turn it back to Dave.
Thank you, John. I'm going to, again, ask everybody to turn your cameras on so we know that you're here, but mute your microphone, at least initially, and we will start into the program here in a minute. We ask you to use the chat function, which you will find at the bottom of the screen, to submit comments and questions, and we'll get to those once we get through the formal presentation. I may ask all of the questions that get there, or I may call on some of you to do some of the join me in making those comments and questions. We are really pleased today to have two academic young women who are, I think you're going to find this a very interesting presentation. Maura Conway is the Associate Professor of Geography at Kutztown University, locally here in Berks County. And her sister Allison Conway is Associate Professor of Civil Engineering at CCNY in New York. And I think you're going to find this presentation very, very interesting. We are all pretty well aware of the growth of distribution centers and warehouses in our region. And I know I look forward to, and I'm guessing the people who register for this event are looking forward to learning more about this. But I think the other thing that you're going to find of interest is the way in which Maura and Allison do their research. The use of mapping and geographic location to plot the data offers a very interesting opportunity for insights into the information that they're presenting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maura.
Okay, so I'm actually going to do the first very brief introduction. I'm Allison, and then I'm going to turn it over to my sister, who is the local expert on the local issues. So first, just to put big picture, again, I know many of you are already very familiar given the importance of this topic in Berks County, but just to sort of put it in scale, why Berks County is so attractive as a warehouse development location. You all know that Berks County is right at the heart of a region that includes many of the largest cities in Pennsylvania, outside of the very large cities. Those are concentrated along major highway corridors, particularly the I-78 corridor, the I-76 corridor, the I-476 corridor, and the I-81 corridor, which provide important connectivity to a number of metropolitan areas, including New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh. And within one day from Berks County and the general, southeastern Pennsylvania region, you can travel both from essentially Canada to Virginia within a 1 day's trip for a truck driver within a single day's work. So this makes this region an extremely attractive region for siting distribution facilities that really serve the entire northeastern US. The warehouses in Berks County, already you're seeing growth over the last several years in a number of areas, as you can see on the map shown. So our goal here is to try to understand what exactly are the impacts that are being traded off when you have to make these types of decisions. So I'm going to turn it over to my sister just to talk a little bit about the beginning of the research that we've done. The first phase of our research was really to try to get a handle on what are the decisions that communities in Berks County and other nearby counties have had to make with regard to warehousing decisions, and how can we start to begin to identify, exactly as you mentioned in your introduction, identify before projects happen, anticipate what are the impacts going to be from that project so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my sister, who will talk to you about some of these local issues, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the data analysis.
Okay, so the first phase of our project was to try to identify what kind of concerns existed in the community and what kind of decisions were necessary when warehousing development was taking place in an area. This is a list of potential land use decisions that have to be considered for warehouse development to take place, including approvals, tax incentives, and relief and variances sought. To get approval to build a warehouse, there are several different steps that might be necessary, including recommendation from a county planning commission, from a township planning commission, approval from township supervisors, school boards, the Department of Transportation, and then overall getting improvement for environmental concerns, stormwater issues, and sewer and other public service issues. Tax incentives, warehouse development can be part of local economic revitalization assistance programs and job creation programs. Often, land use changes are necessary to build warehouses, movement from, say, agricultural to industrial use for land. So reliefs or variances would need to be sought. Those might include height restrictions, bridge proximity to stream, fire code exits, and then parking lot landscaping for both truck and car parking, and then obstruction of loading docks.
So yeah, this got a little bit out of order. So just to point out the outline of our discussion, so that we're going through the introduction right now, and then we'll talk about the case studies. So. Maura, you're on mute.
In order to get an idea of the concerns that existed in the community regarding warehouse development, we completed a newspaper analysis. We analyzed the Reading Eagle and the Allentown Morning Call going back to 2010 and identifying any articles that addressed community concerns for warehouse development. And this is a list of things that came up in the articles that community members are concerned about, divided into several categories. Environmental concerns, those include air quality issues, water quality issues, then both truck related and warehouse related noise creation, light pollution, and potentially loss of endangered species if development is happening on formerly undeveloped area. As warehouses are large structures, they have large amounts of utility demands. Those can include electricity, water, sewage, and also it's very important that they have access to fire prevention and other public safety services. Those that may not have existed in the area as if this was formerly undeveloped land. Concerns about economic impacts, potential change in property values. If those land use changes happen, the surrounding properties might have a change in property value, the high cost to contest the development, and then in general, intangibles, meaning the potential loss of character of the community, changing from agricultural to potentially industrial, and decreased quality of life. I think this mutes me when you move it forward. Other community concerns that have been identified are transportation related, a lot having to do with the growth of truck traffic that comes with warehousing, potential collisions, car and truck collisions, impacts of school bus stops, having to make changes to local roads, detouring traffic, potential obstructions from trucks and the overall warehouse development for driveways, ramps, roads that were did not have this volume of traffic before, now dealing with issues such as inadequate turning radius, sight distance, and then pavement and bridge damage. Other concerns is what happens to trucks overnight. So truck overnight parking, emergency access, as we said, access to fire prevention and other public safeties is essential for the size, due to the size of the warehouses. So the demand, the refill tank rate, and then distance to exits. Overall, by analyzing the concerns and then as well as identifying the potential benefits, we created an overall benefits and costs question is, what are the benefits and costs for e-commerce development in Berks County? By far, the most common benefit that's identified is job creation, that warehouses and then the related truck transportation creates jobs for the community, tax revenue that is brought in, and then associated development that the economic development will spread from the warehouses to the surrounding community. And then summarizing the concerns we identified through our news analysis, traffic and related impacts, the environmental impacts, the growth of utility demands, potential public safety, and then opportunity cost. How does investing in warehouse development, what does that mean for potential other sources of economic development? How do those weigh together within Berks County?
Okay, so now I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about the data analysis that we've done. So the remainder of the presentation, we're going to be presenting the results of the data analysis that we've conducted so far. This is an ongoing study, so we're still working on some elements of it, such as the truck trip generation. But what we'll be presenting for you today will be results regarding the locations of warehouses, the origins and destinations of the workers who are actually working in those warehouses, the characteristics of the jobs created, and just a small preview of the truck traffic analysis that we're working on. So the data sources that we used here, our warehouse location data, we were able to obtain with help from the Berks County Planning Commission. Otherwise, the data sources that we're using are federally available data sources. For origins and destinations, we use the longitudinal employer household dynamics origin destination employment statistics, a very long name, so typically we'll refer to that just as loads data. The loads data has a little bit of a time lag, so the maps that we'll be showing you will cover the time period of 2010 to 2019, because 2019 is the most recently available data that we have for that location information. In terms of job and worker characteristics, the data source that we're using is quarterly workforce indicators, also from the US Economic Census. This data is available from 1997 through either 2020 or 2021, depending on the specific table. But the time frame we'll generally be working in is over the last decade, essentially between 2010 and 2020. And then the final data source we used is just PennDOT's roadway management system, traffic volumes, which was most recently updated in March of 2022. So these are our recent estimates of the traffic. So what I'm going to do for these results, we're going to go through sort of the big picture question that we tried to explore, and then we'll discuss the results of what we found from our analysis related to that question. And I'll be turning it back and forth with my sister to cover different elements of these questions. So first, number and types of jobs. What types of jobs have actually been created? And so this analysis of the job data is going to look at 3 counties. We're going to be looking at Northampton County, Lehigh County, and Berks County. obviously geographically all nearby in the region, but these areas are also at different phases in terms of warehousing development. So there are different lessons we can pull from looking at those different counties. So first, just looking at Northampton County. So Northampton County is the county in the region that has seen the most tremendous warehousing growth over the last, essentially since 2014 is when the warehousing growth really took off in Northampton County. What you can see on this graph is just the total number of jobs per sector. I know this is a little bit of a busy graph, but the blue highlighted is showing the number of jobs by sector in the transportation and warehousing industry. So again, you can see a little over a decade ago in 2010, this made up a fairly small share of the workforce in Northampton County. Over the last decade, since then up until now in 2021, there has been tremendous growth, so that transportation and warehousing is actually the largest employment sector now in Northampton County. So this graph is sorted from 2010 in order of increasing number of jobs. So you can see that it essentially surpassed every other industry during that time frame. Now, the other sectors that are highlighted in color here are the other sectors that are having notable change over the same time period. So you can see the manufacturing sector has also grown, not to the same extent, but there is noticeable growth over the same time period. Accommodation and food services also grew over that time period up until 2019. Those contracted in 2020 and 21 when we expect that's a COVID effect. So we really need some longer term data to understand the long-term impacts there. So digging in, where were these jobs actually created in the transportation and warehousing sector? So that previous data that I showed you was at a 2-digit NAICS code, so North American Industry Classification System, which is how we classify jobs. 2 digits, now we're looking at 3 digits. So we've got extra detail about the type of jobs that were created. And so the primary types of jobs, as you can see in this graph, there are essentially 3 major e-commerce related work sectors here. And you are seeing all of them on this graph: warehousing and storage, truck transportation, and couriers and messengers. So by far the largest share of the jobs are warehousing jobs, and that went from about half of the jobs in 2010 to about 2/3 of the total jobs in 2021 in the transportation and warehousing sector. The other thing you can see on this graph is the impact of a major facility that opened. So in Northampton County in 2018, FedEx Ground opened a major automated warehousing facility, and you can actually see the growth in the courier and messenger industry by the opening of that regional hub, which created a tremendous number of jobs in Northampton County in 2018. So this sort of takeoff after 2018 in the number of courier and messenger jobs is due to that facility. So this is the same graph for Lehigh County, and the scale of these graphs is a little bit deceptive, because if you just take a quick glance at this graph, it looks like Lehigh County has actually had much slower growth than Northampton County, but the reality is Lehigh County just has more growth in other sectors as well. So the actual total number of jobs that were created in transportation and warehousing is only about 2,000 less jobs over this same time frame as Northampton County created. It just gets a little bit buried because there's also been tremendous growth in the green there, as you see, in healthcare and social assistance jobs. We saw the same contraction, that red area, in accommodation and food services over the last 2 years during COVID. Now, this graph goes back a little bit further. I used a larger axis here just to show that Lehigh County really has very similar shape to Northampton County in terms of the changes in the industry that have occurred, but you have to go back a little bit further in time to see the start of that development in Lehigh County. A few differences, though, that you can see here. So in Lehigh County, there is a much lower share of those courier and messenger jobs compared to Northampton County. Again, I think a large piece of that is likely that one very large FedEx facility. But this is also something that could be a function of the specific types of distribution facilities that are operating in a region. So if you have a distribution center that is conducting local deliveries or regional deliveries, that warehouse is going to create jobs in the courier and messenger sector. If the primary function of that warehouse is to transload goods for long haul transportation, it's not going to create very many courier and messenger jobs because they are going to be larger scale transportation happening. Similarly, if your facility is operating returns instead of deliveries, that's going to create a lot of jobs in the warehouse, but it's not necessarily going to create those same local delivery jobs that a local hub would create, for example. So finally, we can look at Berks County. Again, the scale of the graph looks like growth has been much smaller, and it has been much smaller compared to those other counties, which are further down the warehouse development cycle than Berks County. In terms of growth, their growth started longer ago. But we see, similar trends in terms of growth in the transportation and warehousing sector at the front end of those other counties. So we're seeing small amounts of growth in jobs. Something though that is interesting when you look at the warehousing activity in Berks County compared to these other counties at this point in time is that truck transportation is still a fairly large share, a more sizable share of the jobs. Warehousing and storage so far is only about half of the jobs in transportation and warehousing, whereas in those other counties, it's somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the jobs that are created. Now, why do we actually care about this? As we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, the quality of jobs and the types of jobs, and particularly the wages associated with these different sectors, is going to vary. Again, depending somewhat on facility type, but also on the requirements of that job. So just in summary, key findings for what kind of jobs were created. Some important questions that we wanted to look at. First is that there does not seem to be any obvious trade-off occurring looking across these three counties in terms of jobs. So we, prior to looking at this, expected that we might see losses in manufacturing, for example, to trade off for those warehousing jobs, which becomes a more complex question then, because then you have to look into, are manufacturing jobs better than warehousing jobs? But what we're finding is just a net increase in jobs for the most part. And so we don't really see a trade-off happening in terms of the types of jobs. Second is just that, we've already highlighted the points about the counties. This is now the largest sector in Northampton County. And because we're at different locations along the cycle, and because the specific types of facilities that have developed vary from county to county, there is a difference in the split of the specific job mix that's being created by these developments. So next, I'm going to turn it over to my sister to talk a little bit about the mapping that we did to look at the worker home locations. So Maura, I'll just pull up the first map and you can introduce what we've done, and then I'll click through.
Okay. For the next question we had then is, where are the people who work in these warehouses living? If the warehouses are being created in Berks County or the other counties, are the workers coming from the county, or are they coming from other locations? And we use the loads data to try to determine this, which shows us where are the home locations of those that are working in these industries in these three counties. The sector of the loads data that we used is the S102 sector. There is some limitations with this data in that it does not include just transportation and warehousing jobs, but it does include those four categories that are shown up there: utilities, wholesale, retail, and transportation and warehousing. Therefore, in order to study transportation and warehousing, we're using this sector, but it does include these other sectors as well. However, if you look at the graphs for the 3 counties of Northampton, Lehigh, and Berks, you can see here that the retail, the wholesale stays pretty stable throughout our time period that we looked at from 2010 to 2019. And where there's been a lot of change has been in this blue sector, the transportation and warehousing. So as we see change in this sector of jobs, we expect that most of it is in this transportation and warehousing, because these other industries, as well as utilities, which is smaller, much smaller percentage here, have stayed stable over time. First, we're looking at Northampton County, and particularly looking at the 5-year period, the most recent 5-year period where we could get data from 2014 to 2019 is the newest data. Starting here with 2014, you can see on the screen here, on the left, we have a regional perspective. We have all of the states that touch Pennsylvania, and you can see there are people who work in this industry in Northampton County coming from as far away as Ohio and New York State, New Jersey, and our surrounding states. Our map on the right is focusing in more just on this particular county. To think first regionally and to explain a little bit about the maps, if there's any number of workers, it will show up as the purple. So that's the smallest number of workers. And then as it goes up to the yellow, that's the most number of workers. There is one limitation, particularly that of Philadelphia. Just because of the population size of Philadelphia, it's showing up as among the highest on this map, but a lot of that has to do with just the population density. And we're focusing particularly more on the areas right around Northampton County. But you can see on the left that there are people coming to work in these S102 industries from as far away as the surrounding states. Looking to the right in Northampton County, you can see that there is a concentration, particularly along the highway corridors and the densely populated areas within the county. Do you want to click? And this is showing just the change over time from 2014 to 2019. Overall, if we go through it, you can see that there is some expansion out, that it gets a little bit into the green and yellow colors, expand further away from Northampton County as we expand beyond 2019. It's not extreme, but overall, we do see minor amounts of this expansion. And then we can look at the same thing for Lehigh County, the same regional issue, and we find workers throughout the region. But again, this highest concentration in Lehigh County in the densely populated areas, as well as the highway corridors, and some expansion outward from Lehigh County over time from 2014 to 2019. And we can see this change. The purple change is not as substantial because that is the smallest amount of workers. And then finally, looking at Berks County, also we have our regional map, and then focusing in on Berks County, particularly along the highway corridors again, and in the area around Reading, the more densely populated census tracts, we see the higher concentration of workers. And but we do see a fair amount of moderate workforce spread throughout the county of Berks County. And then as we expand into 2019, the similar trend of some expansion outward into the surrounding counties. Overall, the key findings then that there is a concentration of workers in the densely developed areas within those counties, but there is this somewhat growing distribution throughout the outside of the counties, and then there are workers distributed throughout the work counties as well, and expansion into the adjacent counties. The workers do tend to follow the major highway corridors, as we saw. There has been this increase in long distance workers, as we saw people working from as far away as out of states in Ohio, New Jersey, New York, Maryland. Some of this may be due to virtual work that happened pre-COVID, and something that we would need to continue to look into post-COVID or post the beginning of COVID. Long haul trucking that particularly the industry of long haul trucking will have more workers that are living at further away distances, or potentially other factors. This is something that we would like to explore more about what might be impacting these long distance workers.
Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the workers working in these 3 counties in the transportation and warehousing industry, to try to understand not only what types of jobs are being created, but who's actually working in those jobs. So first, we looked at the educational attainment of the workers in the transportation and warehousing workforce. And what you can see, this plot actually shows the net change over time from 2010 to 2020. The important thing to notice here is that by far the largest education sector that we have mapped is actually the unknown education sector. Because of the way the data is defined, it is individuals who are under the age of 24 are not classified. So what this is actually indicating is not so much something about education, but something about age, in that a very large portion of these workers are in that very young category under the age of 24. And we'll actually look specifically at that on the next slide. The other things that you can see here is that there actually has been growth over all education areas in this sector. So everyone from those with less than high school education and up to and including those with a bachelor's or advanced degree. The total number of jobs in general, the overall trend in all 3 counties is growth in all of those areas. So there are jobs being created at different levels of education. Now, we do see some changes. During 2020, you actually see a major increase in the share of bachelor's degree holders working in the transportation and warehousing sector. Again, we need a little bit more change over time to figure out, does that mean something about a change in the type of jobs that are being created? Or does it just mean that during COVID, with changes in available job opportunities, more people with a bachelor's degree were pursuing work opportunities in this field, and it was more of a short-term impact? Why does this matter? Or why might this be an effect of something other than COVID? Is that as we develop new types of warehousing facilities, the actual characteristics of that facility will affect the type of jobs that are created. So if you have a automated warehouse, for example, that has more work to be done in terms of managing technology systems, that might create more jobs requiring a college degree or maybe an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree to have the right skill set in order to operate that technical equipment. So the FedEx facility that was implemented in Northampton County in 2018 is an automated warehouse. So there are going to be automated systems behind the functioning of that warehouse. And so the education level of those job opportunities is going to vary depending on the type of facility that you're developing. So next we looked at age. Again, this just reinforces what we saw on the education slide, is that a very large percentage of the jobs being created in the transportation and warehousing sector are among very young individuals. I should point out, and you will probably ask this question by looking at this graph, that this data does not distinguish between full-time and part-time jobs. So you do see a fairly large percentage of very young people working in these industries. Again, likely a lot of those are those local courier and messenger positions in those very young categories. But in general, we see the net change in jobs is much larger among the young categories. And there is also at least in Lehigh counties and Berks County, a pretty clear indication that there is a loss in jobs at the most senior aged workers. So we're seeing where the significant drop off is occurring is among that over 65 category, and to some extent the 55 to 64 category. There's definitely likely a COVID impact. Again, in 2020, we might anticipate that some of that 65 to 99 is individuals who decided to retire rather than face the health risks associated with COVID. But as you can see on the Berks County graph, this was not solely a COVID impact. You can see that this is an increasing trend that began a couple of years ago in Berks County. And that may be partially a function of the change in the types of jobs that are occurring. So, for example, long haul truck drivers are likely in general going to be an older group. First, there's age limits in terms of being legally able to obtain a commercial driver's license and to operate a long haul truck. Long haul trucking also requires specialized training. So you need a commercial driver's license and specialized training, which it's very difficult to, if not impossible, to obtain at some of the younger age groups. So if long haul trucking jobs are decreasing, then we will likely also see a decrease in the age categories, because just the physical labor associated working in a non-automated warehouse is more likely going to be, those individuals at the younger end of the spectrum. Whereas long haul truck drivers might shift, certainly not exclusively, but up towards the older age of the spectrum. So finally, we looked at race and ethnicity of the individuals working in the sector, and found some interesting results. Again, looking at Northampton, Lehigh, and Berks counties. In all three of these counties, there is a very high share of African American and Black workers in the transportation and warehousing sector relative to the overall populations of the counties. So in all three counties, there is a larger share of Black and African American workers in these sectors compared to the population of the county. However, when we looked at the Hispanic population in all three counties, we actually found inconsistent results in terms of the share of workers. So in Northampton County, the share of workers in the county who are Hispanic is actually about twice the population share. In Lehigh County, the percent of Hispanic workers is slightly higher than the population share. So in both of those counties, it's a larger share of workers in who are Hispanic working in transportation and warehousing relative to the general population. However, in Berks County, we actually found an opposite result. So in Berks County, there is actually a much lower share of workers who are Hispanic working in the transportation and warehousing industry compared to the population of the county. So this was just an interesting result in that they were not consistent across the counties. So again, just to wrap up the key findings, the job gains are among the youngest age groups. The losses are concentrated primarily among the senior age groups. In general, gains are occurring across all education levels. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty with those education just because of the very large number of very young people involved in the sector. There is some gains in bachelor's degree holders observed in 2020, but we need to really see what was happening during COVID to understand those. And I won't rehash the points I just made on the last two slides. So finally, we wanted to look at earnings. So we created these new jobs. We look at who is working in these new jobs and how those jobs are distributed. The last thing we want to see is what is the quality of those jobs and what do the earnings look like in these jobs. So first, this graph or set of graphs just shows the average monthly earnings in the three counties in the three job sectors. So what you can see is consistently across all three counties, the jobs in truck transportation industry are higher wage earning than couriers and messengers and warehousing and storage. Again, that's likely because it is trucking, long haul trucking in particular, is a specialized job requiring particular training and a commercial driver's license. So it requires training, and so it is going to require also higher wages. There's also a nationwide trucker shortage. So there's heavy competition for workers in that sector. Now, in the other industries, we have, again, a little bit of inconsistency in results, nothing too major, but in Northampton County, you actually see essentially stagnant wages in couriers and messengers and warehousing and storage across this time period. In Lehigh County, you see slight growth in recent years, although there was a drop off among couriers and messengers early in the time period. In Berks County, we actually see fairly consistent growth across all three sectors. But again, you should note that, for example, the truck, so here in Berks County, we see less of a difference between the courier and messenger jobs and the trucking industry jobs, and actually see a slight drop off in that trucking industry. Again, I think that's the high paid senior workers leaving the industry. You're seeing that in terms of the wages drop off. But you can see that Berks actually were below 5,000 now in 2020 for average monthly earnings for those trucking jobs, which is lower than you see in the other counties. Not by much, but it's slightly lower. So then we wanted to look at, so how do the wages in transportation and warehousing actually compare to other sectors in the counties? And here again, we find pretty consistent results across all of the counties. The dark blue line is the transportation and warehousing jobs. The other lines shown in color are the sectors where we frequently are concerned about the trade-offs that might be occurring between these jobs in these industries. So again, you can see manufacturing and construction are a little bit higher paid, as well as showing a more steeper slope in growth compared to the transportation and warehousing industry in Northampton County. In Lehigh County, we actually see some growth in wages. Again, Northampton had more of a stagnant wage. Again, I think this is a function of the job mix in the sector. But again, we see fairly consistent results across how these jobs compare to other jobs in separate but related sectors. And then finally in Berks County, again, the results are pretty consistent. So the key findings across all three sectors, I'll come back to in after we go through some of the differences in characteristics. So here we've got the average monthly earnings by age category, and this is just to demonstrate again what we've already talked about, which is that, as you would expect, the longer you are in a career, the higher wages you're going to earn as you move up the scale. So that in general, the highest jobs that we see are the oldest age categories among the most senior workers, although really that 45 to 54 is larger than the highest two age categories. Again, there are likely differences in the types of jobs that are being done. There's also likely some part-time work in those older age categories. We also looked at earnings by education. I think the interesting finding on these graphs is that as you would expect, again, your salary generally increases with education level. However, across all three counties, the differences between less than high school, and some college are fairly small relative to the difference between, say, a bachelor's degree holder and those other categories. So again, just to kind of recap, the earnings vary by both jobs and locations. Again, there's growth is happening in the wages in general, although there has been some stagnation in Northampton County within the warehousing and courier sectors. The high salaries are earned, the truckers are the ones earning the highest salaries. And again, I won't go through all these because we spent a lot of time going through them already, but there is a difference in the age earnings among age groups, as you would expect. The other thing I wanted to mention is what we have focused on here is only jobs in transportation and warehousing, but warehouse development projects are going to have a much broader effect than that. So we have not gone into looking at, how do warehousing development increase the number and quality of construction jobs that are created? How do they increase the jobs in the real estate industry? How do they increase utility jobs because of all the utility work that needs to go into, you know, building those warehouses? So just to be clear, what we've looked at here is the transportation jobs, and there are other jobs that would be created over that same, you know, as a result of those warehouse development projects. So finally, I'm just going to turn it over to my sister to make some very final comments about our truck traffic and next steps, and then we'll be happy to open it up for questions and discussion. So, Maura.
The next topic that we are interested in looking at is the impacts of the truck traffic. How are they impacting Berks County, and looking at where are the trucks traveling in Berks County. This phase of the project we are just beginning now. We don't have a lot of results yet, but I have two maps up here to show you a little bit of what we've done so far. This is mapping the current average daily truck traffic on roads in Berks County, and I believe this was 2019. If you look on the map, the blue are the areas, the zip codes that have contained warehouses, and then the roads are highlighted based on the amount of truck traffic. So those in red have the most truck traffic, and they follow the patterns that you would expect, the biggest highways having the most significant truck volumes, the more dense areas, and we do see connections to the areas with warehouses on them having a fair amount of truck traffic. I'm going to look at the next slide.
Oh, yeah, sorry, forgot I'm controlling it.
Yeah. This is looking at the percentage of truck traffic of all of the traffic that's on the roads. What percentage of it is truck traffic, to think about the potential impacts on the road, going back to some of the issues related to traffic that we talked about at the beginning. What is the percentage of trucks as compared to all of the traffic? And you can see the highways with the red will have up to more than 50% of the traffic being truck traffic, and following similar patterns of the larger highways and areas. We do see patterns of areas closer to the warehouse development. This is something that we are going to continue to expand on. Let me go ahead and see the next steps. The next part of this analysis, besides just mapping the number of trucks on the road, we want to expand this to look at where this is in comparison to the warehouse locations. We want to expand this to understand the surrounding counties as well, to see how Berks County compares to the surrounding counties with truck traffic, and then using PennDOT data that has quality of infrastructure, compare the areas that have less quality infrastructure but high amounts of truck traffic, to see if there are patterns of where those intersect within Berks and our other two counties. And then overall, our next step for the project is to create a summary of all of the results of all of the areas that we talked about today, and to try to identify areas for consideration for warehouse development. We would like to acknowledge this project was funded by the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education Faculty Professional Development Grant. And we'd like to acknowledge the staff from the Berks County Planning Commission for the GIS data and feedback that you've given for the project. And we have a student worker working on the project, Anthony DeFusco. He did those truck maps and has been contributing to the project. And if you have any questions, you can let us know. Okay,
well, thank you both. It's a really, really thought-provoking presentation. So, and it's going to be exciting to see where it all takes you to. A couple of questions. In the map that you showed of where the workers are coming from in Berks County, it looked like the most significant numbers were coming from the immediate area around the city of Reading. And yet the locations where a lot of the places where they were working are much further north on this 78 corridor. Is transportation to work a challenge? that you've been able to find? I know that some of the census tracts that you identified in the city are also the ones that have the highest percentage of people going more than an hour to work each day. And we do know that transportation to work is a challenge for a lot of people in the city.
Yeah, so that is absolutely going to be a big part of the next piece that we look at. We're going to overlay the transit infrastructure. So in general, in warehouse development, this is a huge problem, is that the locations, by design, the locations where warehousing development makes sense typically because of the availability of land are, and because they are particularly located along highway corridors, because that's what makes them accessible to markets for the trucks to leave the facility. They tend to be in isolated locations accessible by highway. And so that makes it difficult for anyone who doesn't have a personal car to get to those facilities. Some encouraging things that we found in this initial phase that I think builds our interest, in particular, look at what innovative solutions are there to get people to work at these facilities, is that there are concentrations of workers in the densely developed areas. So we need to do more analysis, but the fact that there are heavy concentrations of workers in those dense locations across all of the counties, you know, Allentown and Bethlehem and in Reading, obviously within Berks County, that those trips might actually be servable by public transit, either by having a transit route that would serve the facility, or, you know, a lot of warehouses are now having even private sort of shared ride services that are part of the operations, is they do transport their workers, and those will be much more efficient if the workers are concentrated in densely populated areas. So we do think there's opportunity for innovation and for, you know, mitigating the impact even of those car trips along those highway corridors, if you can actually give people reasonable alternatives to get to and from work. There's some challenges because of the timing of the work schedules. You know, a warehouse might not operate during what would typically be peak transit operations. You know, the workers might need to arrive at 4 o'clock in the morning because that's when the transloading needs to happen before something goes out for the day. But it's a very good question, and one we absolutely will be exploring, but we don't quite have the answer to yet.
Okay, good. Are you able to differentiate between who is a employee of the warehouse or distribution center and who is a contracted employee? I mean, is it likely that many of the truckers are contract employees and not employees of the company running the warehouse?
Yeah, so that is not something that we could look at with this data. The data set just does not support that level of analysis, but that's absolutely true in terms of trucking, but it's also true in the courier and messenger industries. As we get into these kind of local last mile distribution, many of the larger operators actually do subcontract, either fully subcontract, or they subcontract during peak periods. So for example, Amazon during the holiday season has operations where you can go work for Amazon with your personal car to make deliveries during the peak period. It gives them the flexibility to flex their capacity. But we haven't actually been able to measure it, but it is an important question. Yeah.
Part of the reason I asked is there are neighborhoods in the city of Reading that have almost become parking lots for trucks and the trailers. And it looks like they're very likely people connected to some of the distribution centers who may live in Reading and use the truck as their way of transportation back and forth to work.
Yeah, and that may also be, you know, Berks County and general Pennsylvania and cities all over the country have a shortage right now in long haul truck parking. It's a problem in most urban areas. without getting into too much complexity, you know, we have truck hour of service regulations, right? So truckers are only allowed to operate a certain number of hours per day. And then we're sending them into, you know, from Berks County into New York City and back, where they might be facing, you know, here in New York, we have 7 hours of traffic congestion a day. And so they might get stuck in the city for 2 hours longer than they anticipated. And what happens is they end up bumping it up against the their hour of service regulation. So they have to, legally, they have to stop driving. And we do not have parking for them in the locations and at the capacities that it's actually needed. So that's why we did have long haul truck parking as a concern here. As you have these drivers that are serving either a full hour day from somewhere like Tennessee or something, arriving by truck, or even operating regionally, because of some of the uncertainties of their hours, there ends up being a high demand for long overnight parking, and that has just not been met. And this is a national problem that's happening in, you know, metro areas all over the country.
Have you had a chance to look at, or perhaps look at, you know, you talked about the impact this has on utilities, on natural resources, on the roads. Have you had a chance to look at what consequences had for property value and perhaps tax income for the communities that have allowed the warehousing to occur there? Is there a dramatic impact there that you know of?
We have not been able to look at that yet. And that is something that, you know, that being able to look at that over time, as this is a more recent development, that I think will be something that we do want to look at in the future. And as this is relatively new, needing the time to be able to do that analysis.
Yeah, understand. We're giving you more assignments here.
Right, exactly.
Is internet access an issue for, you talked about utility access, is that an access issue for warehousing and distribution centers? Do you know?
I have not, that's not something that I have heard come up, but when looking at the other utilities, that would be an important one to consider as well, especially when we're looking at the growth of, you know, automated warehouses and things that, you know, internet would be essential. I think that's not something we have looked at so far, but should be something we look at as part of looking at general utility and services access.
Yeah, and I would just say that having internet access absolutely is important, especially in these supply chains where you're tracking packages across the supply chain. But there are, for not too high demands in terms of information flows, you know, there are remote solutions that don't necessarily require like the hard, like 5G infrastructure, that would be the tremendous cost that you would get, you know, when you need to run power lines, or you need to run, you know, sewer lines to places where they didn't exist before.
I'm going to call on a couple people who submitted comments and let them ask their comments. One of them is Derek Harris. Derek, hopefully you're still on here, but I want you to talk about the Imagine Berks plan and the point you raised there.
Hey, Dave, I'm still on. I can talk about that. One of the things that we had outlined in the Imagine Berks plan from some of the data we found is that Berks County is a net exporter of jobs, and the areas that we export jobs to around us are some of the surrounding areas, whereas the few places we actually have positive migration from are Schuylkill County, and a lot of those jobs are coming into the 78 corridor. But that was just one of the areas that I had a question about, if you had looked at what some of the migration trends look like overall for the county as a whole in terms of net jobs gained versus lost for transportation and warehousing.
Yeah, so again, in terms of actual job creation, our results found that there was growth. But you raise a really good question, and actually one that I think you can see in the maps, is that, you know, if you look at Lehigh County, or for example, There is a very heavy concentration within Lehigh County in these jobs. You see very dark yellows and greens in Lehigh County and to some extent in Northampton County. But you can see a lot of the jobs are very concentrated in those two counties. Whereas Berks, you know, we see obviously a very heavy concentration, but just as you mentioned, you do see particularly at the borders of Berks County, in Schuylkill County, for example, we do see that a lot of the jobs are sort of in those border areas across the county line in those surrounding counties. So we have not run those numbers yet, but we absolutely could do that with this data. And I'm taking notes right now so that we can run that calculation.
Somebody raised a question about, it's our understanding that both Northampton and Lehigh counties have moved to multi-municipal planning and zoning efforts to try to concentrate the location. Have you seen any consequence of that in your research? And is that something Berks County should be thinking about?
So I don't know a ton about the specific projects in Lehigh County, but having had discussions with individuals there, I think that it definitely is beneficial just in that if you have, you know, freight in general, freight transportation crosses a lot of borders. You cannot plan effectively for truck traffic without understanding what's happening at your county borders. And when it comes to these warehousing development issues, it really gets more local than that. So, you know, it might be a specific township that is voting whether or not to approve the project. But if there is another township adjacent to that one that is between that township and the I-78, there's going to be very substantial impacts on that in-between county. And so I do think that more coordinated planning across townships and across counties is needed to really help everyone to be fully aware of what the impacts are and really, because maybe one township approves a project and that in-between county doesn't approve the small transportation improvements that might make truck flows into that facility more efficient because, you know, they're controlling a piece of the network. And so I don't have the answer to the best way to do it, but I would say that it absolutely is needed because of the way that, you know, it's very different from public transportation in that, you know, when you run a transit system, most of what you're doing is moving people within your county or within your county and very nearby suburbs. Whereas for freight, all bets are off. You're moving things all across the globe. So
I'm going to call on a man who's heavily involved in this stuff. Jeremy Zaborowski has raised a couple questions, I think, about, he works for the Industrial Development Authority here in Berks County, and this is an area that they have an interest in, but Jeremy is pretty responsive and responsible in how he does it. So Jeremy, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I just written kind of a lengthy question, I guess. So that's why Dave passed it over to me. But the general question is, you know, we're seeing a lot of these kind of end of life planning for malls right now as they're getting repurposed and reused. And malls in general have higher utility requirements than these warehouses. You know, 1 million square feet of warehouses maybe has a dozen toilets, whereas your mall will have many more than that. Power is also a bigger demand at these malls. But a lot of the repurposing of the malls is still running into utility constraints. They still don't have adequate capacity for multifamily housing, for condos, whatever the case may be. So I was wondering if you had seen any examples in your research of these warehouses that might have already gotten to the end of the useful life. You know, their clear heights are already too low for market, competitiveness or whatever else. They have even more constraints. What are you seeing them being reused for?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I think we will have the answer to very soon, just given the speed of turnover, not necessarily in the counties we're studying here, because we have seen it, you can see it's just astronomical growth. There's very few facilities that are being repurposed. However, I do think particularly in more urban areas, including the one I'm in right now, during the coronavirus pandemic, e-commerce operators were very aggressive in expanding their footprints and investing in new warehousing facilities. And their distribution strategies have evolved quickly, making some of those warehouses already, they're not technically obsolete in terms of there's nothing wrong with it to serve the function that it always served. But what it is, but it's not the most efficient way to do the operation now that they've run more optimization models within those areas. So I think we can see from there, I mean, a lot of those facilities actually had originally been repurposed only within the last 5 years. So from things like, and this is a function of our zoning as well, but things like car dealerships that became vacant and then they got turned into a distribution facility. And so I would imagine if it can go that direction, that it can go back in the same direction where those facilities can flex for those different types of uses. I realize this is not a very straightforward answer to your question, but I think there is potential for flexibility of use of these facilities as we've seen moving in both directions within e-commerce supply chains.
Thank you. One of the reasons I raised the question about transportation to work is that we've done some work in the past with an organization called Commuter Services in Pennsylvania. And Michelle from there would like to talk about what they do to try to help employers try to identify ways for people to come to work. So Michelle, go ahead. Although I guess she has a new laptop and she may not be able to make it work right. We'll keep moving on here. We got a question about, have you looked at the economic consequence of converting farmland into distribution center space? Is there an economic loss as well as an economic gain to be identified in that part of the equation?
Yeah, so we probably need to do some more detailed analysis. I will say what we saw from these high level graphs was we expected that we might see trade-offs in these counties, you know, among jobs, but there really is no substantial trend that we can see yet where there is a gain in warehousing jobs that's being traded off for a loss in agricultural jobs. I think that is a place where I think we need to do a little bit more analysis about the relationship between those sectors. Just for example, so I was looking at possible explanations for why Berks County has such a lower share of its Hispanic population working in the warehousing sector compared to the agricultural sector, for example, or compared to its overall population. And one of the things that I found was that the agriculture sector in Berks County has an extremely high concentration of Hispanic population in the agricultural sector. Again, I think that's probably a function of age. It's probably a function of the specific job tasks associated and training opportunities and things like that. For example, maybe not having opportunities to have commercial driver training to take advantage of that larger share of trucking jobs in Berks County. So short answer is I don't want to give a definitive answer to this. What this graph is showing is that we do not see any substantial trade-off so far. But again, Berks County is so early in this cycle compared to the other counties. The other counties, you really don't, they I think have a lower share of agriculture to begin with, but we're not seeing losses in agriculture in any of the three counties. There's sort of, I guess this is earnings. Sorry, I'm showing you the wrong graph. You go all the way back to the sector graphs. So Sorry, I should have highlighted agriculture here because this is gonna, let me see if I can quickly highlight it here. I'll just make it a different color here. Yeah, so you can see like this is Berks County agricultural jobs. The change in shape here is not because of change in agriculture jobs. That thickness of that line is basically remaining stable. So these results don't indicate a trade-off happening right now, but that doesn't mean one isn't coming. And so I think it's something to track and to watch in terms of the jobs that are happening in the agricultural sector.
Okay, good. Michelle is not able to unmute herself. I'm going to call on her now quickly for a second.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. I apologize. New laptop, so I was frantically trying to unmute myself. I apologize. I'll take 2 seconds to let everyone know. Most of you know about our program, but for those of you who do not, we have free transportation resources. So for all of these people, all the workforce that you want to recruit and retain for these distribution centers, for that workforce you want to get to your site, this is a free transportation resource. Our program is Commuter Services of Pennsylvania. I invite all of you to download our free app called Commute PA to see how easy it is to navigate and to search for potential ride share matches. So in a nutshell, what we do is connect individuals so that those who want to save money on their work commutes or those who do not have reliable transportation in order to get to where your distribution centers are located, they can find a carpool match that they can have reliable transportation for work.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so
Allison,
much.
Sure. Allison and Maura, have you seen any evidence of, particularly in Lehigh and Northampton County, because they've been at this longer than we have, any evidence of impact on housing, either the available housing stock or housing prices?
We have not looked at housing yet, but again, this is something that that's something that came up in the community concern is changing property values and changing local taxes. And that is something that we want to look at as we see this get further along in the process.
Okay, good. Do you know if any of the other counties have done any specific workforce development efforts to provide education and training for workers in the distribution centers and the warehouses that we ought to be thinking about? And I know I'm going to get a question here from Dan Fogarty.
Yeah, I would say that's actually was one of the primary drivers of why we wanted to look at jobs, is to understand where there's a need for workforce training programs. Again, things like truck driver training. Again, if there's going to be tremendous growth in warehousing in your community and the best paid jobs associated with that warehouse are the trucking industry, then you want to make sure that Berks County is going to be able to benefit from those trucking jobs. And so absolutely, one of the things we intend to produce in our final report is recommendations for potential job training programs and how those could be implemented. There absolutely are examples nationally, probably more a lot of areas. I guess the areas with the most developed programs are those in the vicinity of the major port facilities. So again, like the Port of LA Long Beach and I am completely blanking on the name of the corridor, coming out into the Inland Empire. That's the word I was reaching for. In the Inland Empire, as warehousing grew out away, they have done a lot of work into trying to ensure that local communities actually benefit from those types of training programs. And again, those could be commercial driver training programs. Those could be training in the, for the technician positions to operate an automated warehouse if you're going to have automated facilities coming up. So that's a huge area that we are very interested in. And as we continue down we will be following up on a number of those items as we continue the project, so that our final report absolutely is going to include just some general recommendations. And I would welcome any other specific issues that Dan or others on the call think we should be looking at. We would be pleased to do so if you want to give us
You'll hear it
advice.
right now. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, and both Doctors Conway, thank you for, this is so timely. We're in the midst here at the board of reviewing our 4-year plan, and the world looks different than it did 2 years ago. So this is very timely. I would suggest a couple of things. One is, I did put in the chat, but we have over the last 2 years seen some very strong indicators that in fact are trade-offs occurring between manufacturing employment at the entry level, you know, those $18 to $21 an hour jobs with the growth of the distribution center here over the last 2 years. We are a little different. So when you roll us all together with the Lehigh Valley, it may not be as apparent, but if you focus on Berks County, we look forward to working with you going forward. Just so you know, our manufacturing sector is, the good news is 94% recovery of jobs prior to the pandemic. The bad news is it's 94%. So that 6% delta coincides almost directly with the rise of warehousing jobs here in the county. So, and just the anecdotal information is there's just direct competition for those entry-level workers. What's really helpful that you shared with us that we had missed was the fact that the preponderance of young people going into those warehouses. So that's something we value that input. But you know, our manufacturing sector is 3 times as big as the transportation warehousing sector here in Berks County. That's not the case in the Lehigh Valley.
Right.
So I think it's just natural from a market share standpoint that, you know, the other data point is at the beginning of the pandemic, Amazon had no presence in Berks County whatsoever. They now are a 3rd largest employer with 3,500 employees. So I think there definitely is some trade-off in this county that we'd like to work with you guys on to understand better. So thanks for the analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we actually, you know, should be clear on some of the location analysis that we did. What we were looking at was the places where people live. We could run those same maps in the places where people work and possibly get some different results. So no, thank you. I really appreciate your input, and we can definitely dig in a little bit more on both at a geographic scale as well as a sub-industry scale to try to better understand those trade-offs.
Right. I'll reach out to you separately. Thanks for sharing your contact information to share kind of our latest numbers in this area, because it'd be good to compare notes. Great. Really, really great stuff and very timely. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have an audience member who wants to make a brief comment, and I'm going to call on him for a second. Joe Malda. Oh, well. We will keep going and maybe we'll come back to him.
I'm sorry, I'm here. I forgot to unmute. Thanks, Dave. No, I just want to go back to, and I'm sorry, my camera is on the fritz. I can't get it to work, but I want to go back to a comment that Jeremy made about adaptive reuse. I do know anecdotally of a few mall type spaces or former retail spaces that have been reused by as distribution centers in New Jersey. And so I know it's been working there. It's mostly for middle mile or last mile type facilities. And I'd also like to point to our good neighbor in the east. The state of Jersey has trying to address this warehouse expansion in a responsible way. The state of New Jersey has developed a set of guidelines, not mandates. Their planning commission has published these for municipalities to use as tools that address exactly a lot of the issues that we see here. Responsible use of land, proper zoning, communicating with adjacent municipalities and engaging them on traffic concerns and impacts of the congestion, et cetera. But I'll post I'll drop a link in the chat if anybody's interested in looking at it. It's not specific, particularly groundbreaking, but it is helpful, I think, for municipalities in just having a checklist of things to consider.
Yeah, and I would just second your point actually about both the NJTPA, the New Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, and LVPC, so the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission. Both of those organizations are absolutely at the forefront of these issues and trying to work with communities to solve these problems, and have been published a lot of resources. So we obviously didn't share that today, but a lot of what I've learned about these issues and why we got interested in this project to begin with was in seeing the work that was being done in those places, in particularly in North Jersey, sort of again along the I-78 corridor coming out of the port between there and Berks County, basically, and the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission again. So agreed.
This may be a strange and inconsequential question, but we've had a number of people who run distribution centers who also are involved in the production of things. Are there supply chain issues that we should be attentive to here in Berks County relative to these distribution centers? Or, I mean, I guess it's going to depend more specifically on what the distribution center and the warehouse is there for, but.
Right.
Are
Yeah.
there consequences there?
So in terms of supply chain issues, I think, again, if you look at these three counties, I'm not 100% sure if I'm understanding the question right, but
That's okay, I don't either.
You know, the specific function that a facility is serving is going to have a big impact on how it interacts with the supply chain again. So for example, in the Lehigh, in Northampton County, but it's actually the Lehigh Valley Airport, which the airport's within Lehigh County, but immediately adjacent to it is the FedEx facility, which is in Northampton County. You know, when you have a proliferation of e-commerce facilities, there may be a growing influence of air, you know, there may be growth in air travel. So I don't think the Reading Airport has a substantial amount of air traffic, and I'm not sure what capacity it could bear, but Lehigh Valley had a major growth in air traffic because they now have a FedEx hub adjacent to the airport. And the reason I'm bringing up air transportation is express services involving air transportation operate on a very strict supply chain, right? Everything leaves, anything that's flying overnight in the US on FedEx leaves wherever it came from, lands in Memphis by midnight, gets transloaded on a plane out of Memphis by 3 a.m. That plane comes and lands to whatever metro area that thing is being distributed to at 5 a.m. and then goes into the city again. If we're talking about New York here, you know, it lands at Newark Airport, gets into Manhattan by 7 and is on the truck to its final destination at 9. There is not a lot of flexibility in that supply chain. So, you know, when you start to get at things like, can you put in regulations that say the trucks can only access the warehouse during non-overnight hours? That is not going to work if you're dealing with a facility that's serving that type of express operation with those kinds of limitations. Other types of facilities might be more flexible in terms of, you know, being able to tolerate limits in the hours of operation and things like that, for example.
That's interesting, Allison, because the Berks County Commissioners are seriously evaluating the Reading Airport and how it could be more important to the broader community. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to weigh in, because I know you've got a project being developed right next to that.
I haven't been part of those conversations. I just know that, yeah, there's a lot of conversation about how to make the traffic increase at the airport to just provide more and more value to the community. We certainly are ready to support that in any way we can. But yeah, I'm not privy to any additional information.
Okay, we're winding down near the end here. I'm going to ask two last questions. One is, what advice and counsel do you give to Berks County based on your research already? What should we be thinking about? What should we be doing?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
Or
I
you
know
wanna
it's
take
not
this one?
fair.
I can talk about what I mentioned, and Allison can talk about the topics she looked at. Since we still haven't looked at the traffic, we need to look at that in more detail to see what might need to be considered in that area. In terms of the origin and destination, which is what I looked at, is thinking about where are the workers coming from, that this is something that should be considered. As we mentioned, the potential ride share, this is something that could be potentially be expanded as increasing the access of workers and trying to really understand where people are coming from, and either if it's not available to use public transit, to use private transportation, if we can identify, core areas of where workers are coming from.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just say, what we hope to produce at the end of this is a comprehensive guidance. Our intent is not to make your decision for you. It's to make sure that all of the issues that could potentially arise are identified and point to places that have best practices. And I would say that I really do think that Berks County has an opportunity that we talked about them a lot, but Lehigh and Northampton did not have, in that you do have the opportunity to learn from the experience of nearby neighbors. That is not to say that their experience is just because they're next door. As you already pointed out, the trade-offs in sectors is not going to be the same. The populations are not the same. The densities are not the same. But I really do think that just in terms of identifying, like, what are the problems that might arise, Berks County is in a good position to learn from what's already taken place in the region, to take that into account at sort of the planning stage, and maybe even build in some of these things into the development decision-making process or the project approvals process, asking for commitments of how this thing that's developing is going to operate, so that you can mitigate some of these impacts. Like, just a specific example. So if a large warehousing facility is being built and there's a shortage of long haul trucking in the neighborhood, is there a way that as part of the development approvals process, you can require or ask the developer to ensure that that site includes some minimal amount of overnight truck parking that sort of helps you solve, as part of the development process, the problem that might be coming down the road as a function of that facility.
Great. Thank you. And again, I want to also thank you for highlighting the use of GIS and mapping as a way of really analyzing and understanding data, because I think it really was very, very helpful in getting us to understand a lot of the information. So the final question is, so when's your homework going to be done, and when we're going to how we're going to be able to see it?
I think we can commit to our phase 1 report by the end of this year, but as you saw in the chat box, I think we could study this problem for the next 5 years and not solve it. But yeah, the intent is that by early next year, really, I would say probably end of January, Maura. I'll let you put a deadline on it.
Yes, I think by the winter, after our semesters are over, be able to work on that in the winter and have a phase 1 report, and then think about all of the comments that were made today, where we might want to go next.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank our audience. As I said, we have recorded this program. We will share that with everybody who registered, including the people who actually showed up in person. I'm going to compile the questions and comments and share those with you and with the audience as well. Allison and more people have asked whether or not we could get a copy of your presentation. I have the earlier version of it. If you want to send me the more current version, I can send that out to everybody as well. This is terrific. And I know we had a number of people from the county involved in the conversation, or at least watching the conversation today. And I'm sure they will take away some lessons from this as well. So thank you very much. Very, very interesting, very helpful, and very supportive. not all positive, but not all negative either. Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
good rest of
you.
your day.
Yep,
Bye.
thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you.